The security cameras at Riverside Shopping Center captured everything that happened that Tuesday afternoon. But what they couldn't record was the moment when FBI Special Agent Marcus Rivera realized the quiet woman being processed for evidence had a secret that could change everything. What started as routine witness questioning after an armed robbery would become the discovery that Sandra Chen wasn't just an unlucky bystander who happened to work at the jewelry store. She was someone the federal government had spent years keeping hidden, someone whose true identity was marked permanently on her skin in a code that only the most experienced federal agents would recognize. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning had started like any other at Riverside Shopping Center, a mid-sized mall in the suburban town of Millbrook, Connecticut. Built in the 1980s during the area's economic boom, the mall had weathered decades of changing retail trends and now served as a comfortable anchor for the local community. The jewelry store, Elegant Treasures, occupied a corner spot near the main entrance, its display windows catching the morning sunlight and casting brilliant reflections across the polished floor tiles. Sandra Chen had been working at Elegant Treasures for exactly 8 months, ever since she'd moved to Millbrook from what she told people was out west. At 34, she carried herself with a quiet efficiency that customers appreciated but rarely noticed. Average height with dark hair kept in a simple ponytail, she dressed conservatively in clothes that seemed chosen more for practicality than style. Her coworkers knew her as reliable, punctual, and remarkably good at helping customers without being pushy or aggressive. What they didn't know was that Sandra approached everything with the methodical precision of someone who'd been trained to notice details that others missed. The way she organized inventory wasn't just neat, it was systematically arranged so that any disruption would be immediately apparent. Her customer interactions weren't just polite, they included subtle assessments of body language, voice patterns, and behavioral cues that most retail workers would never think to monitor. Even her position behind the counter was carefully chosen to provide clear sightlines to all entrances and exits. Sandra's manager, Betty Rodriguez, had hired her after a brief interview in which Sandra's references checked out perfectly, and her background appeared refreshingly normal. Betty ran Elegant Treasures with the kind of hands-on attention that came from 30 years in retail, and she'd learned to value employees who showed up consistently and handled customers professionally. Sandra exceeded both requirements while somehow managing to remain almost invisible among the staff. "She's like having a ghost who gets all the work done," Betty had mentioned to her husband just the week before. "I hardly notice she's there, but everything runs smoother when Sandra's working." The other employees had similar impressions. Maria Santos, a part-time college student who worked weekends, found Sandra helpful, but distant. "She knows everything about the inventory," Maria had told her roommate. "Like everything. She can tell you exactly what we have in stock without even checking the computer. But she never talks about herself. I don't even know if she has a family or hobbies or anything." James Walker, the store's assistant manager, appreciated Sandra's work ethic but sometimes found her attention to detail almost unnerving. "She notices things," he explained to his wife, "customer behavior, security patterns, even when the cleaning crew changes their schedule. It's like she's constantly analyzing everything around her. Probably just anxious about security, which isn't a bad thing in retail." What none of them realized was that Sandra's hyper-awareness stemmed from years of training that had nothing to do with customer service and everything to do with survival. Her ability to memorize inventory reflected skills developed in environments where knowing the location of every piece of equipment could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her customer assessment techniques had been honed in situations where reading people incorrectly could have fatal consequences. The jewelry store itself reflected the changing nature of American retail. Once a thriving anchor in a busy mall, Elegant Treasures now served a more modest but steady clientele of local residents shopping for engagement rings, anniversary gifts, and special occasion jewelry. The store's layout was traditional glass display cases arranged in a horseshoe pattern around the main floor, with the register station positioned to provide oversight of the entire space. A small office in the back served for private consultations and storage of higher-value items. Sandra had quickly learned the store's routines and rhythms. The morning rush between 9 and 11 when people stopped by before work. The lunch hour lull when foot traffic dropped significantly. The afternoon pickup between 2 and 4 when mothers shopping with children browsed while waiting for school dismissals. The evening couples who came in after dinner to look at engagement rings or anniversary gifts. She'd also learned the mall's security patterns. The rent-a-cop who made rounds every 45 minutes. The maintenance staff who cleaned the common areas each morning and evening. The delivery schedules for the various stores. The locations of all security cameras and their coverage angles. Information that might seem excessive for a jewelry store clerk, but felt natural to someone whose previous life had required constant environmental awareness. Tuesday morning brought the usual routine. Sandra arrived at 8:30 to help Betty open the store, checking inventory and preparing the displays for the day's customers. The morning passed quietly with a few regular customers and several browsers who left without purchasing anything. By noon, Sandra was working alone while Betty attended a district manager meeting at another location. The lunch hour lull felt different that day, though Sandra couldn't immediately identify why. Her instincts, honed by years of training she couldn't discuss with anyone, suggested something was off about the mall's usual patterns. Fewer security guards visible. Different maintenance personnel than usual. Subtle changes in the flow of foot traffic that might mean nothing or might indicate something significant. At 12:45, Sandra was reorganizing a display of wedding bands when she noticed a man in a dark jacket standing near the fountain in the mall's common area. He'd been there for nearly 20 minutes without moving, which violated the normal patterns of mall visitors who typically kept walking unless they were waiting for someone specific. His positioning provided clear sightlines to several store entrances, including Elegant Treasures. Sandra continued her work while maintaining peripheral awareness of the man's location. When another individual in similar dark clothing appeared near the opposite end of the mall corridor, her internal alert system activated completely. Two people positioned for optimal surveillance coverage was beyond coincidence. At exactly 1 o'clock, both men began moving toward the jewelry store with purposeful strides that eliminated any remaining doubt about their intentions. Sandra's training kicked in automatically, her mind shifting into the analytical mode that had kept her alive in situations most civilians couldn't imagine. Assessment. 2 suspects approaching with clear criminal intent. Environment. Minimal civilian presence due to lunch hour timing. Resources. Standard retail security measures only. Options. Comply with demands while gathering intelligence for later testimony. The first man entered the store and immediately moved to block the entrance, while his partner approached the counter where Sandra stood. Both wore dark jackets that could conceal weapons, and their coordinated timing suggested professional planning rather than opportunistic crime. "Nobody needs to get hurt," the second man said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "We just need access to your inventory." Sandra raised her hand slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. "The register is right here," she said quietly. "I can open it for you." "Not the register," the man replied. "The good stuff, in the back." Sandra nodded, understanding that they wanted access to the higher-value items stored in the office safe. Her compliance was automatic, but her mind was already working on multiple levels, gathering details about the suspect's appearance, speech patterns, and behavior that would be crucial for later identification. What the robbers couldn't know was that Sandra's calm demeanor under extreme pressure wasn't the result of shock or fear. It was the product of training that had prepared her for situations far more dangerous than retail robbery. Her ability to remain analytically focused while appearing completely cooperative reflected skills developed in operational environments, where maintaining cover could mean the difference between mission success and exposure that might prove fatal. As she led the robbers toward the back office, Sandra was already planning her testimony, memorizing details, and preparing for whatever investigative process would follow. What she couldn't anticipate was that the routine evidence collection that always followed such crimes would soon expose a secret she'd spent years keeping hidden. Sandra's hands remained steady as she guided the 2 men toward the back office of Elegant Treasures, her movements careful and deliberate. The smaller of the 2 robbers stayed positioned near the store entrance, occasionally glancing toward the mall corridor to monitor for approaching security or unexpected customers. His partner, who appeared to be the leader, followed Sandra closely while maintaining enough distance to react if she attempted anything unpredictable. The back office of Elegant Treasures was cramped but efficiently organized, containing Betty's desk, filing cabinets, and the store's main safe where higher-value inventory was secured overnight and during slow periods. Sandra had memorized the safe's location and general security features during her first week of employment, not because she planned to access it inappropriately, but because understanding her environment completely had become second nature after years of operational training. "Open it," the lead robber instructed, gesturing toward the safe with a confidence that suggested he knew exactly what he expected to find inside. Sandra knelt beside the safe and began entering the combination that Betty had shared with her for inventory purposes. Her fingers moved smoothly across the dial, but her mind was cataloging every detail about the robbers that might prove useful later. The leader's jacket was expensive, not the kind of clothing typically associated with opportunistic criminals. His shoes were leather, well-maintained, and suitable for running if necessary. His watch was digital with multiple functions, possibly including timer capabilities for coordinating the robbery's duration. The second robber's voice carried a slight accent that Sandra couldn't immediately place, but his vocabulary and grammar suggested education beyond high school. His positioning near the entrance demonstrated tactical awareness of sight lines and escape routes. Both men moved with the kind of coordinated efficiency that indicated previous experience working together. "How long does this usually take?" the leader asked, his tone suggesting impatience but not panic. "The safe is older," Sandra replied quietly. "Sometimes the mechanism sticks, another few seconds." The truth was that Sandra was deliberately slowing the process, not to delay the inevitable, but to gather more observational data. The leader's question about timing suggested they were working within a specific schedule, possibly coordinated with mall security patterns or other external factors. His comfort with waiting indicated confidence that they weren't immediately threatened by discovery. The safe opened with a solid click, revealing several trays of higher-end jewelry that represented a significant portion of Elegant Treasure's most valuable inventory. Diamond rings, gold necklaces, and luxury watches were arranged in organized rows, each piece tagged with inventory numbers and price codes that Sandra had helped Betty organize just the previous week. "All of it," the leader said, producing a black canvas bag from inside his jacket, "everything in the trays." Sandra began transferring jewelry from the safe to the bag, her movements efficient but not rushed. Each piece she handled represented hours of work for legitimate customers who had saved money to purchase meaningful gifts for people they loved. The violation of that trust felt personal, but Sandra maintained her emotional detachment while continuing to gather intelligence about the crime in progress. "You're handling this well," the leader observed, watching Sandra's steady hands as she filled the bag. "Most people would be crying or shaking by now." Sandra glanced up briefly. "Getting upset won't change anything. I just want this to be over without anyone getting hurt." The response was honest but incomplete. Sandra's calm demeanor reflected training that had prepared her for situations far more dangerous than retail robbery. Her ability to compartmentalize emotions while maintaining analytical focus had been developed in operational environments where panic could compromise missions and endanger lives. The skills that made her valuable in classified operations also made her an ideal witness for criminal proceedings. The second robber called from the front of the store. 2 minutes. Security guard just passed the electronics store." "Almost finished," the leader replied, then turned back to Sandra. "You've been very cooperative." "That's smart. People who make things complicated usually regret it." Sandra nodded while transferring the last few pieces of jewelry to the bag. The threat was implied rather than direct, but the message was clear. Her compliance was being noted and appreciated, which might influence how the robbers treated her as they concluded their crime. "Now we need you to stay in this office for exactly 10 minutes, the leader continued. "Don't call security, don't call police, don't leave this room. We'll be long gone, and everyone stays safe, understand?" "I understand," Sandra replied. "Good. If you follow instructions, this is just a property crime. If you don't, it becomes something more serious." The robbers left the office, closing the door behind them. Sandra remained seated beside the empty safe, listening to their footsteps as they exited through the store and into the mall corridor. She counted seconds in her head, tracking their likely progress toward whatever exit route they had planned, while considering her next actions. 10 minutes would give the robbers significant time to escape the immediate area, but it would also ensure that Sandra couldn't provide real-time information to security personnel who might intercept them. The instruction was tactically sound from the criminal's perspective, though Sandra had no intention of following it completely. After exactly 3 minutes, Sandra stood and moved to Betty's desk phone. She dialed 911 and waited for the emergency operator to answer. "This is Sandra Chen at Elegant Treasures in Riverside Shopping Center. We've just been robbed. 2 male suspects armed robbery. They took jewelry from our safe. They left approximately 4 minutes ago, heading toward the North Mall entrance." The operator immediately began gathering information about Sandra's condition, the suspects' descriptions, and the circumstances of the crime. Sandra provided clear, detailed responses while moving to the office door to listen for any indication that the robbers might return. "Are you injured, ma'am? Do you need medical attention?" "I'm not injured. They were professional, no violence, but they knew exactly what they wanted and where to find it. This wasn't random." Sandra's assessment was accurate. The robbers had demonstrated knowledge of the store's layout, security procedures, and valuable inventory locations that suggested prior surveillance or inside information. Their timing coincided with the lunch hour when foot traffic was minimal, and Betty was attending her district manager meeting. "Officers are on their way, ma'am. Please remain where you are until they arrive. Don't touch anything the suspects might have touched." Sandra acknowledged the instructions while mentally reviewing everything she had observed during the robbery. Physical descriptions, clothing details, speech patterns, behavioral indicators, timing elements, and tactical choices that might help investigators identify and apprehend the suspects. Within 6 minutes, Sandra could hear sirens approaching the shopping center. Mall security arrived first, followed quickly by Millbrook Police Department patrol officers who secured the scene and began preliminary interviews. Sandra remained in the office as instructed, prepared to provide comprehensive testimony about everything she had witnessed. Detective Sarah Martinez was the first investigator to interview Sandra, taking detailed notes about the robbery's timeline and the suspect's behavior. Sandra's responses were precise and thorough, providing the kind of specific information that experienced detectives appreciated from cooperative witnesses. "You noticed a lot of details for someone under that kind of stress," Detective Martinez observed. "Most robbery victims remember fragments, but you're giving me complete descriptions." "I tried to stay calm and pay attention," Sandra replied. "I figured the more information I could provide, the better chance you'd have of catching them." The response was truthful, but didn't reveal that Sandra's observational skills had been professionally developed through training programs that most civilians never knew existed. Her ability to maintain analytical focus under pressure was the product of years preparing for situations where noticing crucial details could determine mission success or failure. "We're going to need you to come to the station for a formal statement," Detective Martinez explained. "The FBI might also want to interview you since this appears to be part of a larger pattern of jewelry store robberies in the region." Sandra nodded her agreement while feeling the familiar tension that came whenever federal agencies became involved in situations touching her life. Her cooperation with local police was straightforward, but FBI involvement always carried the risk of deeper background checks that might reveal information she preferred to keep private. Betty Rodriguez arrived at the store within an hour of the robbery, her concern for Sandra's well-being genuine and immediate. As the store's manager, Betty would handle insurance claims and corporate reporting, but her first priority was ensuring that Sandra felt supported after experiencing what had to be a traumatic event. "Are you sure you're okay?" Betty asked repeatedly. "You can take the rest of the week off. The district manager completely understands." Sandra appreciated Betty's concern, but felt no need for time away from work. The robbery had been stressful but not traumatic in the way that might affect someone without her background. Her main concern was providing authorities with information that might help apprehend the suspects and recover the stolen merchandise. As investigators continued processing the crime scene, Sandra remained available for additional questions while beginning to consider the implications of increased law enforcement attention in her carefully constructed new life. The jewelry store robbery at Elegant Treasures marked the beginning of what federal investigators would later classify as a significant escalation in a pattern of coordinated retail crime spanning 3 states. By Thursday morning, 48 hours after Sandra Chen had calmly guided 2 professional thieves to the store's safe, FBI Special Agent Marcus Rivera was reviewing case files that painted a disturbing picture of sophisticated criminal organization targeting high-end jewelry retailers across New England. Agent Rivera had been tracking what the Bureau designated as the Northeast Jewelry Circuit for nearly 8 months, following a trail of meticulously planned robberies that demonstrated unusual tactical sophistication and insider knowledge. The Elegant Treasures robbery represented the 14th confirmed incident in the pattern, with preliminary estimates suggesting total losses exceeding $2 million in luxury merchandise. Rivera's office at the FBI's Hartford Field Station reflected the organized intensity of someone who approached complex investigations with methodical precision. Multiple monitors displayed digital maps marking robbery locations, timeline charts tracking the criminal organization's activities, and photographic evidence from crime scenes across Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. File folders containing witness statements, security footage, and forensic reports covered every available surface of his desk. The pattern that had emerged over months of investigation suggested a criminal organization with capabilities far beyond typical retail robbery crews. The suspects demonstrated knowledge of store layouts, security systems, employee schedules, and inventory locations that indicated extensive surveillance and possibly corrupt relationships with individuals having access to retail operations. Their coordination and timing suggested military or law enforcement training, while their ability to avoid identification despite multiple witness encounters indicated sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques. "This isn't random crime," Rivera had explained to his supervisor during their weekly briefing. "These people are conducting intelligence gathering, operational planning, and execution phases that mirror professional training. Someone with serious tactical background is running this operation." The Elegant Treasures robbery had provided investigators with their most detailed witness account to date, thanks to Sandra Chen's remarkably precise observations and cooperative attitude during questioning. Her testimony included specific details about the suspect's clothing, equipment, coordination methods, and behavioral patterns that exceeded the quality of information typically gathered from civilian witnesses under extreme stress. Detective Sarah Martinez from the Millbrook Police Department had shared her interview notes with federal investigators, specifically highlighting Sandra's unusual composure and analytical awareness during the robbery. "Most victims remember fragments and emotions," Martinez had written in her report. This witness provided tactical assessments of the suspect's methods and timing that suggest either exceptional natural observation skills or some kind of relevant background experience. Rivera found Sandra's witness account particularly valuable because it confirmed several behavioral patterns he had identified in previous robberies. The suspect's use of specific timing windows, their knowledge of security patrol schedules, and their calm professionalism under pressure matched descriptions from other crime scenes. Sandra's detailed observations provided crucial corroborating evidence that strengthened the Bureau's understanding of how the criminal organization operated. The federal investigation had been complicated by the sophistication of the criminal organization and their apparent ability to avoid leaving traditional forensic evidence. Security camera footage from multiple locations showed individuals wearing clothing and accessories that obscured facial features without appearing obviously suspicious. Fingerprint evidence was minimal, suggesting the use of gloves or other protective measures. Even witness descriptions varied significantly, indicating possible use of disguises or appearance-altering techniques. Rivera had requested permission to interview Sandra Chen personally, recognizing that her exceptional witness account might contain additional details that could advance the investigation. Federal interviews often revealed information that local police questioning missed, particularly when witnesses had time to process their experiences and remember additional details about the crimes they had observed. The interview was scheduled for Friday morning at the FBI field station, with Sandra agreeing to provide expanded testimony about her observations during the Elegant Treasures robbery. Rivera planned to conduct a comprehensive debriefing that would explore every aspect of her interaction with the suspects, hoping to identify behavioral indicators or tactical choices that might help predict the criminal organization's future activities. Sandra's agreement to the federal interview reflected her genuine desire to help law enforcement apprehend the individuals who had robbed Elegant Treasures, but it also created complications she hadn't anticipated when she first called 911. FBI interviews typically included background verification procedures that went far beyond local police questioning, potentially exposing aspects of her history that she preferred to keep private. The morning of the interview, Sandra dressed in the same conservative style she maintained at work, choosing clothing that projected cooperation and reliability without drawing attention to herself. Her preparation included reviewing her memories of the robbery to ensure her testimony remained consistent and accurate, while also considering how to respond to questions about her background that might arise during federal questioning. The FBI field station building reflected the Bureau's emphasis on security and professionalism, with controlled access points, metal detectors, and reception procedures that reminded Sandra of federal facilities she had visited during her previous life. The institutional atmosphere felt familiar in ways that she couldn't acknowledge to her current associates, carrying memories of briefings and debriefings conducted in similar environments under very different circumstances. Agent Rivera met Sandra in the building's main lobby, introducing himself with the formal courtesy that federal agents used when interviewing cooperative civilian witnesses. His appearance suggested someone who took physical fitness seriously, while his demeanor indicated the kind of analytical mindset that Sandra recognized from her own operational background. "Ms. Chen, thank you for coming in. I know this requires time away from your work, and we appreciate your willingness to help with this investigation." "I want to do whatever I can to help you catch these people," Sandra replied. "What they did was wrong, and I don't want them to hurt other store employees or customers." Rivera led Sandra to an interview room equipped with recording equipment and configured for extended questioning sessions. The room's layout was designed to be comfortable but controlled, with seating arrangements that encouraged honest communication while maintaining appropriate boundaries between investigators and witnesses. "Before we begin the formal interview, I'd like to explain what we're hoping to accomplish today," Rivera said, settling into his chair across from Sandra. "Your observations from the Elegant Treasures robbery are the most detailed we've received from any witness in this investigation. We believe these suspects are part of a larger criminal organization that's been operating across New England for almost a year." Sandra listened carefully while Rivera outlined the scope of the federal investigation, describing the pattern of sophisticated robberies and the evidence suggesting professional criminal organization. The information confirmed her intuition that the Elegant Treasures robbery had been conducted by individuals with advanced tactical training rather than opportunistic criminals. "What we'd like to do today is go through your experience step by step, exploring every detail you can remember about the suspect's behavior, equipment, and methods," Rivera continued. "Sometimes witnesses remember additional details when they have more time to process traumatic experiences, and those details can be crucial for identifying patterns." "I understand," Sandra said. "I've been thinking about that day quite a bit, and I think I can provide more specific information than I gave to the local police." Rivera activated the recording equipment and began the formal interview with standard identification and consent procedures. Sandra confirmed her willingness to provide testimony and acknowledged that the interview was being recorded for investigative purposes. "Let's start with your first awareness that something unusual was happening," Rivera said. "Walk me through your observations from the beginning, including anything that seemed off about the normal patterns in the mall." Sandra began describing her recollections of Tuesday afternoon, starting with the subtle environmental changes that had triggered her instinctive awareness of potential threats. Her account included details about the suspect's positioning, timing, and coordination that demonstrated exceptional situational awareness for a civilian witness. Rivera listened carefully while taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific behavioral observations or tactical choices that Sandra had witnessed. Her responses consistently provided the kind of detailed information that experienced investigators valued, raising questions in Rivera's mind about the source of her unusual analytical capabilities. "You mentioned that the suspects moved with quote-quote coordinated efficiency during the robbery," Rivera observed. "Can you describe what you mean by that phrase?" Sandra considered her response carefully, recognizing that her answer might reveal more about her own background than she intended to disclose. Sandra paused for a moment before responding to Agent Rivera's question about the suspect's coordinated efficiency, aware that her answer needed to be accurate without revealing the depth of tactical knowledge that allowed her to make such assessments. Her years of operational training had taught her to recognize professional movement patterns, but explaining that recognition to a federal investigator required careful consideration of how much expertise to display. "They move like they had practiced together before," Sandra said finally. "One person always knew where the other was positioned, and they seemed to communicate without talking much. When the first man entered the store, the second one automatically took a position that covered the entrance. It wasn't random. They had assigned roles." Rivera nodded while making notes, recognizing that Sandra's observations aligned with behavioral patterns the Bureau had identified in other robberies conducted by the same criminal organization. Her ability to articulate tactical concepts suggested either natural analytical ability or exposure to environments where such awareness was developed and valued. Did you notice anything specific about their equipment or clothing that seemed unusual for typical robbery suspects? Rivera asked, probing for details that might provide investigative leads. Their jackets were expensive, Sandra replied. Not the kind of clothing you'd expect from people who needed to steal jewelry. The fabric looked like it was designed for active use, maybe tactical or outdoor gear. And their shoes were leather but practical, like they were prepared to run if necessary. Rivera's pen stopped moving as he looked up from his notes. Sandra's description of tactical clothing and practical footwear choices reflected the kind of detailed equipment assessment that most civilian witnesses wouldn't think to make, even when specifically asked about suspects' appearance. When you say the jackets looked designed for active use, what specific features made you think that? Rivera pressed, curious about the source of Sandra's apparent familiarity with tactical equipment. Sandra realized that her response had revealed more analytical depth than typical witnesses would demonstrate, but she couldn't retract observations that might help identify the suspects. The material looked durable, and the cut seemed loose enough to allow movement without restricting arm mobility. Also, the pockets appeared to be positioned for easy access while moving. The level of detail in Sandra's equipment analysis exceeded what Rivera typically heard from civilian witnesses. But he continued the interview while making mental notes about her unusual observational capabilities. Some people possessed natural tactical awareness, while others developed such skills through military service, law enforcement training, or other professional experiences that required environmental assessment abilities. Let's talk about their communication patterns, Rivera said, shifting focus to another aspect of Sandra's testimony. You mentioned they didn't talk much during the robbery. Can you describe the communication you did observe? Brief, functional statements only, Sandra replied. The person near the entrance called out timing updates, 2 minutes, when he spotted the security guard. The leader gave direct instructions without explaining reasoning. They acted like people who had worked together before and understood each other's methods. Rivera recognized that Sandra's analysis of the suspect's communication patterns demonstrated understanding of how professional teams operated under pressure. Her observations about minimal verbal communication and understood roles suggested familiarity with operational environments where such efficiency was necessary for mission success. Did either suspect display any nervous behaviors or signs of stress during the robbery? Rivera asked, exploring whether the suspects had shown indicators of inexperience or anxiety that might suggest vulnerability to pressure tactics. No obvious stress indicators, Sandra said. Their movements stayed controlled throughout the entire incident. Heart rates might have been elevated, but they didn't display visible signs of panic or uncertainty. They seemed comfortable with the situation. The precision of Sandra's behavioral assessment impressed Rivera while simultaneously raising additional questions about her background. Most robbery witnesses focused on their own fear and confusion, rather than conducting analytical evaluations of suspects' psychological states during crimes in progress. Ms. Chen, your observations are remarkably detailed for someone experiencing a traumatic situation, Rivera said, deciding to address Sandra's unusual witness capabilities directly. Do you have any background that might explain your ability to notice and remember so many specific details? Sandra had been expecting this question since agreeing to the federal interview, but it still created the familiar tension that arose whenever her carefully constructed background faced scrutiny from law enforcement professionals. Her response needed to satisfy Rivera's curiosity without revealing information that could compromise her protected status. I've always been observant, Sandra said. My family emphasized paying attention to surroundings and being aware of what's happening around you. I guess it became a habit to notice details that other people might miss. The answer was truthful but incomplete, omitting the professional training that had transformed natural observational tendencies into sophisticated analytical capabilities. Rivera accepted the explanation, while noting that some families did emphasize situational awareness, particularly those with military or law enforcement backgrounds. Have you ever served in the military or worked in law enforcement? Rivera asked, following the logical progression of questions about backgrounds that might develop tactical awareness. No military service, Sandra replied truthfully. I've worked in retail for several years, and you learn to watch customer behavior to prevent theft and identify potential problems. Again, Sandra's response was accurate without being complete. Her retail experience was legitimate, but it hadn't been the source of her tactical knowledge. Rivera noted her answer while observing that retail security awareness typically focused on shoplifting prevention rather than the kind of operational assessment Sandra had demonstrated. "Let's return to the robbery timeline," Rivera said, shifting back to investigative details. "Can you estimate how long the entire incident lasted from when the suspects entered the store until they left?" "Approximately 8 to 10 minutes total," Sandra replied. "They moved efficiently without rushing, which suggested they were working within a planned time frame rather than reacting to immediate pressure." Rivera appreciated Sandra's ability to provide specific timing estimates, recognizing that accurate timeline information was crucial for correlating the Elegant Treasures robbery with security camera footage from other mall locations and nearby businesses. "During those 8 to 10 minutes, did you observe anything that might indicate the suspects had specific knowledge about Elegant Treasures' operations, security procedures, or inventory storage?" Sandra considered the question carefully, recognizing that her answer might provide important investigative leads while potentially implicating current or former store employees in the criminal conspiracy. "They knew exactly where to find the safe without searching or asking questions," Sandra said. "They also seemed to understand our security procedures. The timing suggested they knew when Betty would be away from the store and when foot traffic would be minimal." Rivera made detailed notes about Sandra's assessment of the suspects' insider knowledge, recognizing that her observations supported the Bureau's theory that the criminal organization had access to information about Target Store's operations through corrupt employees or extensive surveillance activities. "Did you notice any reaction from the suspects when they saw the safe's contents? Surprise, disappointment, satisfaction?" "No visible reaction," Sandra replied. "They acted like they knew what to expect, which suggests they had specific information about our inventory value and storage procedures." The interview continued for another hour, with Rivera exploring every aspect of Sandra's observations while Sandra provided detailed responses that consistently demonstrated exceptional analytical capabilities. Her testimony strengthened the federal investigation while raising questions about her background that Rivera noted for possible follow-up investigation. As the formal interview concluded, Rivera thanked Sandra for her cooperation and explained that federal investigators might contact her again if additional questions arose during the ongoing investigation. Sandra expressed her willingness to provide further assistance while privately hoping that her involvement with federal authorities would end with this single interview. "Ms. Chen, one final question," Rivera said as Sandra prepared to leave. "Is there anything else about the robbery that you've remembered since speaking with local police? Any detail that seemed insignificant at the time but might be relevant now?" Sandra thought for a moment, genuinely trying to recall additional information that might help the investigation. "The leader mentioned that I was handling the situation well compared to other people in similar circumstances. That suggests they've done this before and have experience evaluating how different victims react under pressure." Rivera nodded, recognizing that Sandra's final observation provided additional confirmation that the Elegant Treasure suspects were part of an organized criminal enterprise with extensive experience conducting sophisticated retail robberies. As Sandra left the FBI field station, she felt relief that the interview had concluded without deeper exploration of her background, but she also recognized that federal investigations often involved multiple phases and follow-up contacts that she couldn't predict or control. Agent Rivera remained in the interview room after Sandra's departure, reviewing his notes and considering the unusual quality of testimony she had provided. Her observations were invaluable for the investigation, but her analytical capabilities raised questions about whether a routine witness interview had revealed someone with undisclosed relevant experience. The following week brought an unexpected development that would transform Sandra's carefully maintained low profile into something she had spent years trying to avoid. 3 more jewelry stores across Connecticut and Massachusetts were robbed using identical methods to the Elegant Treasures incident, with security footage from 2 locations providing the clearest images yet of the suspects' faces and operational techniques. Agent Rivera found himself coordinating a multi-jurisdictional task force as the FBI officially designated the jewelry store robberies as a priority federal investigation. The additional crimes had provided enough evidence to confirm that a sophisticated criminal organization was conducting coordinated operations across state lines, elevating the case to a level that demanded significant Bureau resources and interagency cooperation. Sandra returned to work at Elegant Treasures the Monday following her FBI interview, hoping to resume the quiet routine that had defined her life in Millbrook for the past 8 months. Betty Rodriguez had been understanding about Sandra's time away for law enforcement interviews, recognizing that employee cooperation with criminal investigations was both necessary and commendable. "How did it go with the FBI?" Betty asked as Sandra arrived for her morning shift. "I hope they weren't too demanding. Federal agents can be intimidating." "Agent Rivera was professional," Sandra replied honestly. "He asked detailed questions about what I observed during the robbery, and I tried to provide as much helpful information as possible." Betty nodded approvingly while unlocking the store's main display cases. The insurance company had already processed the robbery claim, and new inventory was arriving daily to replace the stolen merchandise. Elegant Treasures was recovering from the financial impact of the crime, but the emotional effects on staff would take longer to resolve. "I still can't believe how calm you stayed during the whole thing," Betty continued. "Most people would have been terrified, but you handled it like you'd been trained for emergencies." Sandra felt the familiar discomfort that arose whenever colleagues commented on her unusual composure under pressure. "I just tried to stay focused on getting through it safely," she said, deflecting the observation without directly contradicting Betty's assessment. The morning proceeded normally until approximately 10:30, when Sandra noticed a familiar figure approaching the store entrance. Agent Rivera was walking through the mall corridor with purposeful strides that suggested official business rather than casual shopping. His presence at Elegant Treasures could only mean that the federal investigation had reached a new phase requiring additional witness cooperation. "Miss Chen," Rivera said as he entered the store, "I apologize for interrupting your work, but we need to speak with you about a significant development in the case." Betty looked concerned as she realized that Sandra was being requested for additional law enforcement cooperation. "Is everything all right? Has something happened?" "Nothing that affects store security," Rivera assured Betty. "We just need Miss Chen's assistance with some follow-up questions related to her witness testimony." Sandra felt the familiar tension that accompanied any unexpected contact with federal authorities, but she maintained her cooperative demeanor while preparing for whatever new complications the investigation might bring to her carefully constructed life. "Of course," Sandra said. "Should I come to your office again?" "Actually, we'd like you to view some evidence here at the store," Rivera replied. "It would be helpful to have you examine certain materials in the same environment where you made your original observations." Rivera gestured toward the mall corridor, where Sandra could see additional individuals who appeared to be federal agents or technical personnel. The presence of multiple investigators suggested that whatever evidence they wanted her to examine was considered significant for the ongoing investigation. "Betty, would it be possible for Sandra to step away from work for approximately an hour?" Rivera asked. "This could be important for apprehending the people who robbed your store." "Absolutely," Betty replied immediately. "Sandra, take whatever time you need. Catching these criminals is more important than anything happening here this morning." Sandra followed Rivera toward the mall corridor, where she was introduced to FBI technical specialist Jennifer Walsh and evidence analyst David Park. Both individuals carried equipment cases that suggested they were prepared to conduct some form of evidence presentation or identification procedure. "Ms. Chen, we've obtained security footage from the other robbery locations that provides much clearer images of the suspects than what was available from Elegant Treasures," Walsh explained. "We'd like you to view this footage and confirm whether these are the same individuals who robbed your store." The group proceeded to a vacant storefront that had been temporarily converted into a mobile command center for the federal investigation. Technical equipment had been set up to display high-resolution security footage on multiple monitors, while evidence boards showed photographs, timeline charts, and analytical summaries related to the jewelry store robbery pattern. Sandra was impressed by the scope and sophistication of the federal investigation, recognizing the kind of comprehensive analytical approach that she associated with major criminal or national security operations. The evidence displays reminded her of briefing rooms she had known during her previous life, but she maintained her civilian witness persona while examining the materials Rivera's team wanted her to review. "This footage comes from a robbery that occurred last Thursday in Springfield, Massachusetts," Park explained as he activated one of the monitors. "The camera angles are much better than what we had from Riverside Shopping Center." The security footage began playing, showing two men entering a jewelry store with the same coordinated timing and tactical positioning that Sandra remembered from the Elegant Treasures robbery. The video quality was indeed superior, providing clear facial images and detailed views of the suspect's clothing, equipment, and behavioral patterns. "Those are definitely the same people," Sandra confirmed after watching several minutes of footage. "Same coordination, same roles, same general appearance. The leader is wearing different clothes, but his movement patterns and body language are identical." Rivera noted Sandra's confirmation while observing that her analysis of movement patterns and body language again demonstrated the kind of detailed behavioral assessment that exceeded typical witness capabilities. Her ability to identify suspects based on tactical behaviors rather than just facial features suggested analytical training that went beyond civilian experience. "Can you point out specific behaviors or actions that make you certain these are the same suspects?" Walsh asked, hoping to gather additional confirmation that could be used in future court proceedings. Sandra studied the footage more carefully, identifying specific coordination techniques and timing choices that matched her memories from the Elegant Treasures robbery. The way the first person positions himself near the entrance while maintaining sight lines to the counter. The leader's hand signals when he wants to communicate timing information. The systematic approach to gathering merchandise without rushing or displaying obvious stress. Park paused the footage at several points where Sandra had identified behavioral matches, creating still images that could be used to document her witness confirmation of suspect identity across multiple crime scenes. "Ms. Chen, your ability to recognize these behavioral patterns is remarkable," Rivera observed. "Most witnesses focus on facial features or clothing, but you're identifying tactical similarities that require understanding of how professional teams operate." Sandra realized that her analytical capabilities were again attracting attention from federal investigators, but she couldn't provide less thorough testimony without potentially compromising the investigation's success. "I've always been good at noticing patterns," Sandra said, offering the same general explanation she had used during her formal interview. "When you see the same coordination techniques used in identical situations, the similarities become obvious." Rivera accepted Sandra's explanation while making mental notes about her consistent demonstration of tactical awareness that suggested possible undisclosed background in environments where such skills were developed and refined. The evidence review continued for another 30 minutes, with Sandra confirming suspect identities from footage taken at 3 different robbery locations. Her testimony provided crucial corroborating evidence that strengthened the federal case against the criminal organization, while raising additional questions about the source of her unusual analytical capabilities. As the evidence review concluded, Rivera thanked Sandra for her continued cooperation and explained that her witness testimony was proving invaluable for building a comprehensive case against the suspects once they were apprehended. "We may need to contact you again as the investigation progresses," Rivera said. "Your observations have been more helpful than typical witness testimony, and we appreciate your willingness to assist federal authorities." Sandra expressed her continued willingness to cooperate, while privately hoping that her involvement with the investigation would remain limited to witness testimony rather than expanding into background verification that might reveal information she preferred to keep confidential. 2 weeks after Sandra's evidence review session, the jewelry store robbery investigation took a dramatic turn that would forever change her quiet life in Millbrook. The FBI task force had been tracking the criminal organization's movements across New England when they received intelligence suggesting that the suspects were planning another coordinated operation, targeting multiple stores simultaneously in the Hartford metropolitan area. Agent Rivera coordinated with local law enforcement agencies to establish surveillance at potential target locations, while federal technicians worked to intercept communications that might reveal the timing and specific objectives of the planned robberies. The operation represented the Bureau's best opportunity to apprehend the suspects while they were actively engaged in criminal activity, rather than attempting to track them after they had already disappeared into the regional transportation network. Sandra was working her regular morning shift at Elegant Treasures when Betty Rodriguez received an unexpected phone call from mall security requesting that all jewelry stores implement enhanced security protocols immediately. The request was vague but urgent, suggesting that law enforcement had received credible intelligence about potential criminal activity targeting retail establishments in the area. "They want us to move all high-value inventory to the safe and keep minimal merchandise in the display cases," Betty explained to Sandra after ending the call with security. "Something about potential organized retail crime activity in the region." Sandra understood that the enhanced security measures likely resulted from FBI intelligence about the criminal organization's planned activities, But she couldn't reveal her knowledge of the federal investigation without explaining her involvement as a witness in the ongoing case. "Should I start moving the expensive pieces to the back office?" Sandra asked, recognizing that reducing visible inventory would make elegant treasures a less attractive target for robbery attempts. "Yes, but be systematic about it," Betty replied. "We still need to maintain normal business operations, so keep representative samples in the displays while securing everything above $5,000. Sandra began transferring high-value jewelry from the display cases to the safe, working with the methodical efficiency that characterized everything she did. Her movements reflected the kind of systematic approach that ensured nothing was overlooked while maintaining operational security for the store's remaining inventory. At approximately 11:15, Sandra noticed increased activity in the mall corridor that suggested law enforcement personnel were positioning themselves throughout the shopping center. The individuals appeared to be conducting routine shopping or maintenance activities, but their positioning and coordination indicated professional surveillance operations rather than coincidental civilian presence. "Betty," Sandra said carefully, "I think we should consider closing the store temporarily. Something feels different about the mall's security situation today." Betty looked out toward the corridor, noticing the subtle changes in foot traffic patterns that Sandra had identified. "You might be right. Let me call the district manager and see if we have authorization to close early for security reasons." Before Betty could complete her phone call, Sandra observed two familiar figures approaching elegant treasures from opposite directions in the mall corridor. The suspects from the previous robbery were moving with the same coordinated timing and tactical positioning that she remembered from their original crime. But this time federal agents were positioned to intercept them before they could enter any retail establishments. "Betty, we need to get behind the counter immediately," Sandra said with quiet urgency. "Lock the register and move away from the display cases." Betty responded to the authority in Sandra's voice without questioning her instructions, recognizing that Sandra's assessment of security threats had proven accurate during the previous robbery attempt. They positioned themselves behind the counter while Sandra maintained visual contact with the developing situation in the mall corridor. The arrest operation unfolded with professional precision as federal agents moved simultaneously to apprehend both suspects before they could initiate their planned criminal activity. Sandra watched through the store's glass front as the coordinated law enforcement response demonstrated the kind of tactical efficiency that she associated with major federal operations. Agent Rivera appeared near Elegant Treasures moments after the arrests were completed, approaching the store to check on Sandra and Betty's condition while ensuring that no additional threats remained in the immediate area. "Ms. Chen, are you and your manager safe?" Rivera asked as he entered the store. "We have both suspects in custody, but we need to secure the scene and conduct preliminary interviews." "We're fine," Sandra replied. "I saw them approaching and recognized the same coordination patterns from the previous robbery, so we took defensive positions." Rivera noted Sandra's ability to identify the suspects based on their tactical behaviors rather than waiting for obvious criminal actions to begin, again demonstrating the kind of threat assessment capabilities that exceeded typical civilian awareness. "We're going to need witness statements from both of you," Rivera continued, "but the immediate danger has passed. These arrests should end the jewelry store robbery pattern that's been affecting the region." Betty looked relieved as she realized that the criminals who had robbed Elegant Treasures were finally in federal custody, but she also seemed confused about how Sandra had recognized the threat before any obvious criminal activity had begun. "Sandra, how did you know those were the same people?" Betty asked. "They hadn't done anything yet when you told me to get behind the counter." Sandra felt the familiar challenge of explaining her tactical awareness without revealing the professional training that enabled such assessments. "Their coordination looked identical to what I remembered from the robbery. Same positioning, same timing, same way of moving together." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Rivera observed the exchange between Sandra and Betty, while noting that Sandra's threat recognition had occurred before most law enforcement personnel would have identified criminal intent based on the suspect's behaviors alone. "Ms. Chen, we'd like you to come with us for immediate witness identification procedures," Rivera said. "Your confirmation that these are the same suspects from the Elegant Treasures robbery will be crucial for linking them to all the crimes in this investigation." Sandra agreed to accompany federal agents for the identification procedures, understanding that her witness testimony would be essential for ensuring successful prosecution of the criminal organization. However, she also recognized that expanded involvement with federal law enforcement would likely result in more comprehensive background verification than she had experienced during her previous interviews. The suspect identification took place at a temporary processing facility that federal agents had established near the shopping center. Sandra was asked to view both suspects through one-way glass while confirming their identities and providing additional details about their roles during the Elegant Treasures robbery. Subject 1 is definitely the leader from our robbery, Sandra confirmed. Same height, same build, same confident demeanor. Subject 2 maintained perimeter security during the crime, just like he was positioned today before the arrests. Rivera documented Sandra's positive identification while preparing paperwork that would formally link the arrested suspects to the Elegant Treasures robbery and establish her as a key witness for federal prosecution efforts. Ms. Chen, these arrests represent a major success for our investigation, and your witness testimony has been instrumental in achieving this result, Rivera said. However, we'll need you to remain available for additional proceedings as the case moves through the federal court system. Sandra understood that her involvement with the federal investigation would continue far beyond the immediate arrest phase, potentially including grand jury testimony, pretrial depositions, and eventual courtroom appearances that would maintain her visibility within federal law enforcement systems. As the identification procedures concluded, Sandra felt a mixture of satisfaction about helping apprehend dangerous criminals and concern about the ongoing exposure to federal scrutiny that prosecution proceedings would require. Her carefully maintained low profile was being systematically dismantled by circumstances beyond her control. The drive back to Elegant Treasures gave Sandra time to consider how dramatically her situation had changed since the morning when two professional thieves had entered the jewelry store and unknowingly initiated a chain of events that would force her back into the world of federal investigations and law enforcement attention she had worked so hard to escape. The arrest of the jewelry store robbery suspects created complications that Sandra had anticipated but hoped to avoid. Within 48 hours of providing witness identification testimony, she received a formal notification from the U.S. Attorney's Office that she would be required to testify before a federal grand jury as part of the prosecution's case against the criminal organization responsible for 14 confirmed robberies across 3 states. The grand jury subpoena represented exactly the kind of extended federal involvement that Sandra had feared when she first agreed to cooperate with Agent Rivera's investigation. Grand jury proceedings required comprehensive background verification of witnesses, detailed testimony under oath, and potential follow-up questioning that could expose aspects of her history that she preferred to keep confidential. Sandra sat in her small apartment that evening, reading the official documents that outlined her legal obligations as a federal witness while considering how to navigate the upcoming testimony without compromising her carefully protected status. The subpoena included specific dates for her appearance and warnings about the legal consequences of failing to cooperate with federal prosecutors. Her apartment reflected the same deliberate anonymity that characterized everything about her life in Millbrook. Furnished with practical pieces that revealed nothing personal about her background or interests, the space served as temporary housing rather than a permanent home. Few photographs, minimal personal items, and no decorations that might provide insights into her previous life or current associations. The kitchen table, where Sandra reviewed her legal documents, had become her informal command center for managing the growing complications of her witness role. Federal forms, contact information for prosecutors, and timeline documents related to the robbery investigation covered the surface and organized stacks that demonstrated her systematic approach to complex situations. Agent Rivera had provided Sandra with his direct contact information and encouraged her to call if she had questions about the grand jury process or concerns about her safety as a witness against a criminal organization that had demonstrated sophisticated operational capabilities. His offer reflected standard federal procedures for protecting cooperative witnesses, but it also represented another connection to law enforcement systems that Sandra preferred to avoid. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to Elegant Treasures that would accelerate Sandra's exposure to federal scrutiny beyond anything she had experienced during the investigation phase. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Torres arrived at the jewelry store, requesting a private meeting with Sandra to discuss her upcoming grand jury testimony and review the evidence she would be asked to present. Ms. Chen, I apologize for interrupting your work schedule, but grand jury preparation requires detailed coordination between witnesses and prosecution teams, Torres explained as she introduced herself to Sandra and Betty. We need to ensure that your testimony is comprehensive and accurate. Betty granted permission for Sandra to meet with the federal prosecutor, recognizing that employee cooperation with criminal justice proceedings was both legally required and morally appropriate. The private meeting took place in the store's back office, where Torres could discuss confidential aspects of the prosecution case without public observation. "Your witness testimony has been exceptional throughout this investigation," Torres began. "Agent Rivera's reports indicate that your observations provided crucial details about the suspect's methods and organization that we might not have obtained from other sources." Sandra acknowledged the prosecutor's comments while maintaining the cooperative but reserved demeanor that she had adopted during all her interactions with federal authorities. "I tried to pay attention to everything that might help identify the people who robbed our store." Torres reviewed the evidence that Sandra would be asked to present during grand jury proceedings, including her identification of suspects from security footage, her detailed observations of the robbery methods, and her assessment of the criminal organization's tactical sophistication. "The grand jury will want to understand how you were able to provide such detailed tactical analyses of the suspect's behavior," Torres explained. "Your testimony about their coordination and professional methods has been crucial for establishing that this was an organized criminal enterprise rather than random opportunistic crime." Sandra felt the familiar tension that arose whenever federal investigators focused on her analytical capabilities, recognizing that her tactical assessments exceeded what prosecutors typically expected from civilian witnesses. "I've always been observant," Sandra said, offering her standard explanation. "When you're in a frightening situation, you notice details that might help you stay safe." Torres accepted Sandra's explanation while noting that the quality of her observations suggested either exceptional natural ability or relevant background experience that enhanced her analytical capabilities. "Ms. Chen, grand jury proceedings include background verification of witnesses to ensure their credibility and identify any factors that might affect their testimony," Torres continued. "Is there anything in your personal history that we should be aware of before you appear before the grand jury?" The question represented exactly the kind of inquiry that Sandra had been dreading since her first contact with federal investigators. Background verification for grand jury witnesses typically included comprehensive reviews of employment history, educational records, criminal background checks, and sometimes security clearance investigations depending on the sensitivity of the case. "Nothing that would affect my testimony about the robbery," Sandra replied carefully. "I've been a reliable employee at Elegant Treasures, and I have no criminal background that would compromise my credibility as a witness." Torres made notes about Sandra's response while explaining that standard background checks would be conducted regardless of witness assertions about their personal history. Federal prosecutors required independent verification of witness backgrounds to prevent surprise revelations that might undermine prosecution cases during trial proceedings. "The background verification is routine for all federal witnesses," Torres assured Sandra. "We're not looking for anything specific, just confirming that your testimony won't be vulnerable to defense challenges about credibility or bias." Sandra understood that federal background investigations often revealed information that witnesses preferred to keep private, but she had no legal basis for refusing to cooperate with standard prosecution procedures. "How comprehensive are these background checks?" Sandra asked, recognizing that her question might reveal concerns about her history but needing to understand the scope of scrutiny she would face. "Standard employment verification, education confirmation, criminal history review, and reference checks," Torres replied. "More extensive investigation only occurs if initial reviews identify issues that require additional clarification." The meeting concluded with Torres providing Sandra with preparation materials for her grand jury appearance and contact information for witness assistance services that could help her navigate the federal court system. Sandra expressed her continued willingness to cooperate while privately calculating the risks that comprehensive background verification might create for her protected status. That evening, Sandra made a secure phone call to a number she had hoped never to use again. The contact connected her with Deputy U.S. Marshal Sarah Klein, the federal official responsible for overseeing her witness protection arrangements and ensuring that her safety and anonymity were maintained according to the terms of her original agreement with federal authorities. "This is Sandra Chen, Protected Witness Designation WP 7749, Sandra said when Klein answered the secure line. "I need to report a potential compromise situation involving federal prosecution proceedings." Klein's response was immediate and professional, reflecting the U.S. Marshals Service's standard protocols for protecting witnesses whose safety depended on maintaining confidential identities. "What's the nature of the potential compromise?" Klein asked. Are you facing immediate safety threats, or is this related to identity exposure risks? Sandra explained her involvement in the jewelry store robbery investigation and the upcoming grand jury testimony that would require background verification potentially capable of revealing her protected status to federal prosecutors and court personnel who weren't authorized to access witness protection information. The prosecution team is conducting standard background checks on all witnesses, Sandra continued. If those investigations access sealed records or protected databases, my cover identity could be exposed to people who don't have clearance for witness protection information. Klein understood immediately that Sandra's situation represented the kind of operational security challenge that the Marshal Service worked continuously to prevent, but which sometimes occurred when protected witnesses became involved in unrelated federal proceedings. We'll need to coordinate with the prosecution team to ensure that background verification procedures don't compromise your protected status, Klein said. This may require disclosure of your witness protection arrangement to specific federal officials who need to know. The phone call concluded with Klein promising to contact the U.S. Attorney's Office within 24 hours to arrange security protocols that would protect Sandra's identity while allowing her to fulfill her legal obligations as a grand jury witness. Sandra ended the call knowing that her 8 months of anonymous life in Millbrook were effectively over, regardless of how carefully federal officials managed the disclosure of her witness protection status. The coordination between the U.S. Marshals Service and the prosecution team resulted in an emergency meeting that Sandra never expected to attend. 24 hours after her phone call with Deputy Marshal Klein, Sandra found herself in a secure conference room at the FBI field station, facing a group of federal officials who now knew that their star witness in the jewelry store robbery case was actually a protected witness with a classified background that superseded their investigation. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michelle Torres sat across from Sandra with an expression that mixed professional frustration with genuine concern. Beside Torres, Agent Rivera reviewed documents that had apparently provided him with information about Sandra's true status that explained her exceptional analytical capabilities and tactical awareness during the robbery investigation. Deputy Marshal Klein occupied the chair next to Sandra, serving as her advocate within the federal system while ensuring that witness protection protocols were properly observed during this unprecedented situation. Klein's presence represented the intersection of two separate federal operations that had collided in ways that none of the participants had anticipated. Ms. Chen, Torres began carefully, we now understand that your background verification cannot proceed through normal channels because you're operating under federal protection that prohibits disclosure of your actual identity and history. Sandra nodded, recognizing that her witness protection status was no longer confidential among the federal officials responsible for prosecuting the jewelry store robbery case. The disclosure represented a significant compromise of her operational security, but one that had become necessary to resolve the conflict between her legal obligations and her protected status. Agent Rivera, Torres continued, your investigation reports make much more sense now that we understand Ms. Chen's actual background. Her tactical assessments and behavioral analyses reflect professional training rather than exceptional civilian observation skills. Rivera looked directly at Sandra with an expression that combined respect with curiosity about the circumstances that had brought someone with her capabilities to a quiet retail job in suburban Connecticut. Ma'am, I have to say that your witness testimony was remarkable even before we knew about your background. Now it makes perfect sense. Deputy Marshal Klein interrupted before Rivera could ask questions about Sandra's classified history. Agent Rivera, Ms. Chen's specific background cannot be discussed even within this secure environment. What's important for your investigation is that her witness testimony is accurate and that she can continue to cooperate with prosecution proceedings without compromising her protected status. Torres pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be modified legal documents. We've worked with the Marshal Service to develop procedures that will allow Ms. Chen to testify before the grand jury without requiring disclosure of her protected identity or background details that might compromise her safety. Sandra studied the documents that Torres presented, recognizing that federal prosecutors had created a framework for her testimony that would satisfy legal requirements while maintaining her operational security. The solution represented sophisticated coordination between multiple federal agencies working to protect her while ensuring successful prosecution of the robbery suspects. The grand jury will be informed that you are a federal witness whose background cannot be disclosed for security reasons, Torres explained. Your testimony will focus exclusively on your observations during the Elegant Treasures robbery and your identification of suspects from security footage. Klein added, "No questions about your personal history, previous employment, or circumstances that brought you to Millbrook will be permitted during grand jury proceedings." The prosecution team has agreed to limit their inquiry to information directly related to the robbery investigation. Sandra felt relief that federal officials had found a way to protect her witness protection status while allowing her to fulfill her legal obligations, but she also understood that her involvement in the robbery prosecution had permanently altered her situation in ways that extended far beyond the immediate case. "What happens after the grand jury testimony?" Sandra asked. "Will I be able to continue my current assignment, or does this exposure require relocation to a new protected status?" Klein exchanged glances with Torres before responding. "That decision will depend on several factors, including how much information about your involvement becomes part of the public record, and whether defense attorneys identify any security concerns that might affect your safety." Rivera, who had been listening carefully to the discussion, addressed Sandra directly. "Ma'am, I want you to know that your cooperation with our investigation has been extraordinary. The arrests we made wouldn't have been possible without your detailed observations and witness testimony. The suspects are being charged with 14 counts of armed robbery, conspiracy to commit organized retail crime, and interstate transportation of stolen goods," Torres added. "Your testimony will be crucial for securing convictions that could result in significant federal prison sentences." Sandra appreciated the acknowledgement of her contribution to the investigation while recognizing that her involvement in federal prosecution proceedings would continue for months and potentially years depending on trial schedules and appeals processes. "Are there any restrictions on my activities while the prosecution case is pending?" Sandra asked, understanding that federal witnesses sometimes face limitations on travel, employment, or public activities that might affect their safety or availability for court proceedings. "Standard witness protection protocols remain in effect," Klein replied. "You can continue working at Elegant Treasures unless security considerations require modification of your current assignment. We'll monitor the prosecution proceedings for any developments that might affect your safety." Torres reviewed the timeline for upcoming legal proceedings, explaining that grand jury testimony would likely occur within 2 weeks, followed by potential pre-trial depositions if defense attorneys requested additional witness interviews. "The defense team will not be provided with information about your protected status," Torres assured Sandra. "However, they may ask questions about your background during depositions or trial testimony that we'll need to address carefully to avoid compromising your security." Agent Rivera raised a concern that Sandra had been considering throughout the meeting. Given Ms. Chen's exceptional witness capabilities, defense attorneys are likely to question how a retail employee could provide such detailed tactical assessments of the suspect's behavior. Klein responded, "We've prepared explanations that attribute her observational skills to personal safety awareness and retail security training, which are both accurate without revealing classified information." The meeting concluded with Torres providing Sandra with a modified preparation packet for grand jury testimony that excluded questions about her background while maintaining focus on her observations of the robbery and suspect identification procedures. "Ms. Chen, we understand that this situation has created complications for your protected status that you didn't anticipate when you first reported the robbery," Torres said. "The federal government appreciates your cooperation and remains committed to ensuring your safety throughout the prosecution process." Sandra left the FBI field station with mixed emotions about the day's developments. Federal officials had found solutions that would protect her while allowing the prosecution to proceed, but her 8 months of quiet anonymity in Millbrook had been permanently disrupted by circumstances beyond her control. The drive back to her apartment gave Sandra time to consider how fundamentally her situation had changed since that Tuesday afternoon when 2 professional thieves had entered Elegant Treasures and unknowingly initiated a chain of events that would force her back into the federal system she had worked so hard to escape. Deputy Marshal Klein had promised to contact Sandra within 48 hours with additional security protocols and any modifications to her witness protection arrangements that might be necessary based on her ongoing involvement in federal prosecution proceedings. Sandra understood that regardless of how carefully federal officials managed her case, her role as a key witness in a major federal prosecution had made her visible within law enforcement systems in ways that would affect her protected status for years to come. The quiet jewelry store clerk who had hoped to remain invisible had become a crucial component of a federal case that would determine whether sophisticated criminals received the prison sentences they deserved for terrorizing retail establishments across New England. The grand jury testimony took place exactly 2 weeks later in a federal courthouse in Hartford, where Sandra found herself in the unfamiliar position of being a protected witness giving evidence about crimes she had personally observed. The courthouse security procedures reminded her of federal facilities from her previous life, but now she was entering as a civilian witness rather than someone with official clearance and operational authority. Deputy Marshal Klein accompanied Sandra through the courthouse's security screening and witness preparation areas, ensuring that her protected status was properly maintained while she fulfilled her legal obligations to the federal prosecution. The Marshal's service had coordinated with court security to implement additional protocols that would prevent unauthorized access to information about Sandra's true identity or background. "Remember that you're only answering questions about what you observed during the robbery," Klein reminded Sandra as they waited in the witness preparation room. "If any grand juror asks about your background or how you developed your analytical capabilities, the prosecutor will redirect the questioning to admissible topics." Sandra nodded while reviewing her notes from the various interviews and evidence sessions she had participated in over the previous month. Her testimony would cover her observations of the suspect's behavior, her identification of their coordination patterns, and her recognition of the same individuals in security footage from other robbery locations. Assistant U.S. Attorney Torres joined them in the preparation room to conduct a final review of Sandra's testimony and ensure that all participants understood the limitations that had been established to protect her witness protection status. "The grand jury has been informed that you are a federal witness whose background cannot be disclosed for security reasons," Torres explained. "This designation is not unusual in cases involving organized crime or national security considerations, so the grand jurors will understand why certain questions cannot be answered." The grand jury room itself was smaller than Sandra had expected, with 23 citizens seated in tiered rows facing a central area where witnesses provided testimony under oath. The atmosphere was formal but less intimidating than a traditional courtroom, designed to encourage honest communication between citizens and federal prosecutors investigating potential criminal activity. Sandra was sworn in by the court reporter and took her seat facing the grand jurors, many of whom appeared to be ordinary citizens from the Hartford metropolitan area who had been selected for federal service. Their faces reflected the kind of civic seriousness that characterized people taking their legal responsibilities seriously. Torres began the questioning by establishing Sandra's role as a witness to the Elegant Treasures robbery and her subsequent cooperation with federal investigators. The initial questions were straightforward, focusing on the basic facts of the crime without exploring Sandra's background or analytical capabilities. "Ms. Chen, can you describe what you observed when the two suspects entered Elegant Treasures on the afternoon of the robbery?" Torres asked. Sandra provided a detailed account of the suspects' coordinated entry, their systematic approach to the robbery, and their professional demeanor throughout the crime. Her testimony included specific observations about their timing, communication methods, and tactical positioning that demonstrated the sophisticated planning behind their criminal activity. "Did the suspects appear to have prior knowledge about the store's layout and security procedures?" Torres continued. "Yes," Sandra replied. "They moved directly to the back office without searching or asking questions about the safe's location. They also seemed to understand our staffing patterns and when foot traffic would be minimal in the mall." One of the grand jurors raised her hand to ask a question. "Ms. Chen, you've provided very detailed observations about the suspect's behavior. Do you have security training that helped you notice these patterns?" Torres intervened before Sandra could respond. "The witness's background cannot be disclosed for security reasons, but her observations are based on what she personally witnessed during the robbery." The grand juror accepted the limitation without further questioning, understanding that federal proceedings sometimes involved witnesses whose identities or backgrounds required protection for safety or national security reasons. Sandra continued her testimony by describing her identification of the suspects from security footage obtained from other robbery locations. Her ability to recognize the same coordination patterns and tactical behaviors across multiple crime scenes provided crucial evidence linking the suspects to the broader criminal conspiracy. "When you viewed the security footage from the Springfield robbery, what specific behaviors convinced you that these were the same suspects?" Torres asked. "Their coordination was identical," Sandra replied. The way they positioned themselves for optimal coverage of the store entrance, their hand signal communication methods, and their systematic approach to gathering merchandise without displaying stress or uncertainty. Another grand juror asked, "How were you able to remain so calm during the robbery? Most people would have been too frightened to notice such detailed information." Again, Torres redirected the question. "Ms. Chen, can you describe your emotional state during the robbery and how that affected your ability to observe the suspect's behavior?" "I was definitely frightened," Sandra answered truthfully, "but I tried to stay focused on what was happening so I could provide accurate information to police later. I figured the more details I could remember, the better chance authorities would have of catching the people responsible." The testimony continued for approximately 45 minutes, with Sandra answering questions about the suspect's physical descriptions, their equipment and clothing, and the specific methods they used to coordinate their criminal activity. Her responses consistently provided the kind of detailed information that prosecutors needed to establish the sophisticated nature of the criminal organization. Torres concluded Sandra's testimony by asking her to confirm her identification of the arrested suspects as the same individuals who had robbed Elegant Treasures. Sandra provided a clear, unequivocal confirmation that strengthened the prosecution's case linking the defendants to multiple robbery locations. "Thank you, Ms. Chen. Your testimony has been extremely helpful for our investigation," Torres said as Sandra's grand jury appearance concluded. After leaving the courthouse, Deputy Marshal Klein debriefed Sandra about her testimony and discussed the next phases of her involvement in the federal prosecution case. "You handled that very well," Klein observed. "The grand jurors seemed impressed by the quality of your observations, and the prosecutor was able to present your evidence without compromising your protected status." Sandra felt relief that her grand jury testimony had concluded successfully, but she also understood that her involvement in the federal case would continue through trial proceedings that might last several months. "What happens now?" Sandra asked as they drove away from the courthouse. "The grand jury will likely vote to indict the suspects based on the evidence presented, including your testimony," Klein replied. "After that, we'll need to prepare for potential depositions and trial testimony if the case proceeds to court." Sandra returned to work at Elegant Treasures the following day, attempting to resume the routine that had been disrupted by weeks of federal proceedings. Betty Rodriguez welcomed her back with genuine concern for her well-being after the stress of grand jury testimony. "How did it go?" Betty asked. "I can't imagine how difficult it must have been to face those criminals' defense attorneys." "It was just the grand jury," Sandra corrected. "No defense attorneys were present. It was mainly answering questions about what I observed during the robbery." Sandra's return to normal work routines provided a temporary respite from federal proceedings, but she knew that her role as a key prosecution witness would soon require additional court appearances that would further complicate her efforts to maintain a low profile in Millbrook. 3 months after Sandra's grand jury testimony, the federal prosecution reached a critical juncture that would determine whether her involvement in the case would escalate dramatically or finally reach a conclusion. The defendant's legal team had filed pre-trial motions challenging the admissibility of witness testimony and requesting detailed background information about prosecution witnesses, creating exactly the kind of legal complications that Deputy Marshal Klein had warned Sandra might arise. Defense attorney Robert Castellanos represented the primary suspect from the Elegant Treasures robbery, and his pre-trial strategy focused on undermining the credibility of prosecution witnesses by questioning their qualifications to provide expert-level tactical assessments of his client's behavior. Castellanos had reviewed Sandra's witness statements and recognized that her analytical capabilities exceeded what defense attorneys typically encountered from civilian observers. "Your Honor," Castellanos argued during a pretrial hearing that Sandra was required to attend, "the prosecution's key witness has provided testimony that demonstrates professional-level understanding of tactical coordination, criminal behavior analysis, and operational assessment techniques that far exceed the capabilities of ordinary retail employees." U.S. District Judge Patricia Hawkins listened carefully to Castellanos' arguments while reviewing the extensive witness statements that Sandra had provided throughout the federal investigation. The judge recognized that Sandra's testimony was unusually sophisticated, but she also understood that federal prosecutors had legitimate reasons for protecting certain witness information. Assistant U.S. Attorney Torres responded to the defense challenge by explaining the security restrictions that prevented disclosure of Sandra's background without compromising her protected status. Your Honor, the witness's background cannot be revealed due to federal security considerations, but her testimony is based solely on her personal observations during the crimes in question. Judge Hawkins called for a sidebar conference with both attorneys to discuss the legal implications of Sandra's protected witness status and determine whether additional disclosure might be required for the defendants to receive fair representation. Sandra sat in the courtroom's witness section, accompanied by Deputy Marshal Klein, watching the legal proceedings that would determine how much of her carefully guarded background might be exposed during trial testimony. The courtroom atmosphere felt formal and intimidating, representing the kind of public scrutiny that she had spent years trying to avoid. The defense is entitled to challenge witness credibility, Judge Hawkins explained during the sidebar conference, but federal security restrictions may limit the scope of inquiry into this witness's background. I need to review the specific protections that apply to this situation. The judge scheduled a closed hearing for the following week where federal officials could present classified information about Sandra's protected status to help determine what background information, if any, could be disclosed to defense attorneys without compromising her safety or security. Sandra left the courthouse understanding that her case had entered a phase where federal judges would make decisions about her protected status based on legal principles that might override the Marshal Service's security protocols. The prospect of judicial review of her witness protection arrangements created uncertainties that she couldn't predict or control. Deputy Marshal Klein expressed cautious optimism about the legal proceedings, while acknowledging that federal courts sometimes reach decisions that complicated witness protection operations. Judge Hawkins has experience with classified information and protected witnesses, Klein explained. She understands the security implications of disclosure decisions. The week between hearings gave Sandra time to consider the possibility that her protected status might be partially compromised by court proceedings that required some disclosure of her background to ensure fair trials for the defendants. Federal judges possessed authority to balance security considerations against constitutional rights that might override witness protection protocols. Agent Rivera contacted Sandra during this waiting period to provide updates on the prosecution case and express the government's appreciation for her continued cooperation despite the legal complications that had arose from her witness testimony. Ms. Chen, I want you to know that your evidence has been crucial for building strong cases against all the defendants, Rivera said during their phone conversation. Regardless of what happens with the background disclosure issues, your testimony has already contributed significantly to successful prosecution of this criminal organization. Sandra appreciated Rivera's acknowledgement while understanding that legal proceedings might still require revelations about her history that could affect her long-term security arrangements with the Marshal Service. The closed hearing took place in Judge Hawkins's chambers, with only essential federal officials present to discuss Sandra's protected status and its implications for the criminal trial. Sandra was not permitted to attend this hearing, but Deputy Marshal Klein represented her interests, while Torres argued for continued protection of her background information. Defense attorney Castellanos was allowed to present his arguments about why his client's constitutional rights required disclosure of information about Sandra's qualifications to provide expert-level witness testimony, while federal officials explained why such disclosure might compromise ongoing security operations. Judge Hawkins spent 2 hours reviewing classified documents about Sandra's background before reaching a decision that would determine how much information defense attorneys could access about her previous experience and training. The court finds that the witness's protected status is legitimate and necessary for security reasons, Judge Hawkins announced at the end of the closed hearing. However, some limited disclosure may be required to ensure fair trial proceedings for the defendants. The judge's compromise decision required federal officials to provide defense attorneys with general information about Sandra's background that would explain her analytical capabilities without revealing specific details that might compromise her protected status or safety. Defense counsel will be informed that the witness has relevant professional experience that enhances her observational abilities, but no specific information about her employment history, training, or current protected status will be disclosed, Judge Hawkins ruled. Torres and Klein accepted the judge's decision as a reasonable balance between constitutional requirements and security considerations, while Castellanos argued that limited disclosure might not provide sufficient information for effective cross-examination of Sandra's testimony. Sandra learned about Judge Hawkins' decision through Deputy Marshal Klein, who explained that defense attorneys would now know that she had professional experience relevant to her witness capabilities, but they would not receive specific information about her protected status or classified background. "This is actually a favorable outcome," Klein explained. "The disclosure is minimal and doesn't compromise your operational security, but it provides enough information to satisfy constitutional requirements for fair trial proceedings." The legal resolution meant that Sandra's trial testimony would proceed with defense attorneys having limited knowledge about her background, while most of her protected information remained confidential. The compromise represented exactly the kind of judicial balancing that federal courts use to protect witnesses while ensuring fair trials for defendants. Sandra felt relief that the disclosure issue had been resolved without major compromise of her protected status, but she also understood that trial testimony would now involve cross-examination by defense attorneys who knew she had undisclosed professional experience relevant to her witness capabilities. The federal trial began on a cold February morning 6 months after the original Elegant Treasures robbery, transforming Sandra from a quiet jewelry store clerk into the prosecution's star witness in a case that had attracted regional media attention. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters covering what federal prosecutors had described as the largest organized retail crime prosecution in Connecticut's recent history. Sandra arrived at the courthouse through a secure entrance arranged by the Marshal's Service, avoiding the media attention that surrounded high-profile federal criminal trials. Her testimony would be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, providing the detailed behavioral analysis and suspect identification that linked the defendants to 14 coordinated robberies across 3 states. The courtroom was packed with federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, court officials, and members of the public interested in the outcome of a case that had generated significant coverage in regional newspapers. Judge Hawkins presided over proceedings with the formal authority that characterized major federal criminal trials involving multiple defendants and serious charges. Sandra took the witness stand wearing the same conservative business attire that she favored at Elegant Treasures, projecting the image of a reliable civilian witness while maintaining the dignified composure that her operational training had developed over years of high-pressure situations. Her appearance was designed to reinforce her credibility without suggesting the professional background that remained protected by court order. Assistant U.S. Attorney Torres began Sandra's direct examination by establishing her role as an employee of Elegant Treasures and her presence during the robbery that had initiated the federal investigation. The questioning followed the careful script that prosecutors had developed to present Sandra's evidence without revealing protected information about her background. "Ms. Chen, can you describe what you observed when the defendants entered Elegant Treasures on the afternoon in question?" Torres asked. Sandra provided the same detailed account of the robbery that she had given during her grand jury testimony, describing the suspects' coordinated entry, their systematic approach to the crime, and their professional demeanor throughout the incident. Her testimony included specific observations about timing, communication methods, and tactical positioning that demonstrated the sophisticated planning behind the criminal operation. "Did the defendants appear to have prior knowledge about the store's security procedures and layout?" Torres continued. "Yes," Sandra replied clearly. "They moved directly to the back office without searching or asking questions. They understood our staffing patterns and chose timing that minimized civilian presence in the mall." Defense Attorney Castellanos listened carefully to Sandra's testimony while preparing for cross-examination that would challenge her qualifications to provide expert-level analysis of his client's behavior. The limited background disclosure authorized by Judge Hawkins gave him some information to work with, but not enough to fully understand the source of Sandra's exceptional analytical capabilities. Torres spent 2 hours presenting Sandra's direct testimony, covering her identification of suspects from security footage, her assessment of the criminal organization's methods, and her recognition of behavioral patterns that linked the defendants to multiple robbery locations. Sandra's responses were precise and comprehensive, providing exactly the kind of detailed evidence that federal prosecutors needed for successful convictions. "Ms. Chen, when you viewed security footage from the other robbery locations, what convinced you that these were the same individuals who robbed Elegant Treasures?" Torres asked. "Their coordination was identical across all locations," Sandra explained. "Same positioning strategies, same communication methods, same systematic approach to gathering merchandise. The behavioral patterns were unmistakable." Castellanos began his cross-examination by immediately focusing on Sandra's unusual observational capabilities and analytical assessments that exceeded what defense attorneys typically encountered from civilian witnesses. Ms. Chen, you've provided remarkably detailed analysis of what you describe as, quote, tactical coordination and professional methods, Castellanos said. What qualifies you to make such sophisticated assessments of criminal behavior? Torres objected before Sandra could respond. Your Honor, the witness's background cannot be disclosed due to federal security restrictions that have been previously addressed by this court. Judge Hawkins sustained the objection while reminding Castellanos that his cross-examination was limited to information that had been approved for disclosure during pretrial proceedings. Castellanos modified his approach, focusing on the specifics of Sandra's observations rather than her qualifications to make tactical assessments. Ms. Chen, you testified that the defendants used hand signal communication. Can you describe exactly what you mean by that term? I observed one defendant make deliberate gestures to communicate timing information to his partner, Sandra replied. Brief, purposeful movements that conveyed specific information without verbal communication. And how do you know these gestures were intentional communication rather than random movements? Castellanos pressed. The timing and context, Sandra explained. The gestures occurred at specific moments when verbal communication would have been inappropriate, and the receiving individual responded with immediate behavioral changes that indicated understanding. Castellanos continued his cross-examination for nearly an hour, attempting to challenge Sandra's testimony by questioning her ability to interpret criminal behavior with such precision. However, the limited background information available to him prevented effective impeachment of her credibility or analytical capabilities. Ms. Chen, isn't it true that your interpretations of these so-called tactical behaviors are based on assumptions rather than factual observations? Castellanos asked. No, Sandra replied firmly. My testimony is based on what I directly observed during the robbery and what I recognized in security footage from other locations. The patterns were consistent and unmistakable. Judge Hawkins called for a brief recess during Sandra's cross-examination, allowing federal prosecutors to confer with Deputy Marshal Klein about any security concerns that might have arisen from defense questioning. The cross-examination had remained within the boundaries established by pre-trial rulings, but Klein monitored the proceedings to ensure that Sandra's protected status wasn't compromised. When court resumed, Castellanos concluded his cross-examination without having significantly undermined Sandra's testimony or forced disclosure of protected information about her background. The defense attorney's frustration was apparent, but he had exhausted the limited avenues available for challenging a witness whose qualifications remained largely confidential. Torres conducted a brief, redirect examination to clarify any points that defense questioning might have confused, reinforcing the accuracy and reliability of Sandra's observations while emphasizing that her testimony was based on direct personal experience rather than speculation or assumption. Ms. Chen, are you absolutely certain that the individuals you identified in security footage are the same people who robbed Elegant Treasures? Torres asked. I am completely certain, Sandra replied without hesitation. Their coordination methods, behavioral patterns, and tactical approaches were identical. These were the same individuals. Sandra's testimony concluded after nearly 4 hours on the witness stand, during which she had provided comprehensive evidence linking the defendants to multiple robbery locations while maintaining the protection of her classified background. Her performance under cross-examination demonstrated the kind of composure and credibility that federal prosecutors valued in key witnesses. As Sandra left the courthouse through the secure exit arranged by the Marshal's Service, she felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction about her contribution to the prosecution case. Her testimony had survived aggressive cross-examination while protecting the security arrangements that allowed her to maintain her new life in Millbrook. The trial would continue for several more weeks as prosecutors presented additional evidence and defense attorneys argued for their client's innocence. But Sandra's role as the government's star witness had been completed successfully, without compromising her protected status or revealing information that might endanger her safety. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against the defendants in the federal jewelry store robbery case. Sandra learned about the convictions through a phone call from Assistant U.S. Attorney Torres, who expressed the prosecution team's gratitude for her exceptional witness testimony that had been crucial for securing justice for the victims of 14 coordinated robberies across New England. The jury found the defendants guilty on all counts of armed robbery, conspiracy, and interstate transportation of stolen goods, Torres reported. Your testimony was instrumental in establishing the organized nature of their criminal enterprise and linking them to multiple crime scenes. Sandra felt genuine satisfaction knowing that her cooperation with federal authorities had helped ensure that dangerous criminals would face significant prison sentences for their sophisticated robbery operation. The convictions represented successful resolution of a case that had begun with her decision to provide detailed witness testimony rather than minimal cooperation with law enforcement. The sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later, where Judge Hawkins imposed federal prison terms ranging from 12 to 18 years for the defendants, reflecting the serious nature of their organized criminal activity and the impact of their crimes on retail establishments and employees across 3 states. Sandra did not attend the sentencing hearing, but Deputy Marshal Klein informed her that Judge Hawkins had specifically mentioned the quality of witness testimony that had enabled successful prosecution of the case. The judge's comments acknowledged the courage of civilian witnesses who provided detailed cooperation with federal investigations despite potential risks to their personal safety. The court recognizes that this prosecution succeeded largely due to the exceptional cooperation of witnesses who provided detailed, accurate testimony about sophisticated criminal activity, Judge Hawkins stated during sentencing proceedings. Their willingness to participate in federal proceedings ensured that justice was served for victims of these organized crimes. Sandra's role in the federal prosecution officially concluded with the defendant's convictions and sentencing, but her experience as a protected witness had been permanently altered by the visibility that court proceedings had brought to her carefully maintained anonymity. The Marshal's Service conducted a comprehensive security review to determine whether her continued residence in Millbrook remained viable or required relocation to a new protected assignment. Deputy Marshal Klein met with Sandra at a secure location to discuss the results of the security assessment and her options for continuing her witness protection arrangements. The review had concluded that her court testimony had not compromised her protected status sufficiently to require immediate relocation, but ongoing monitoring would be necessary to ensure her continued safety. Your protected status remains secure, Klein explained. The limited background disclosure during trial proceedings didn't reveal specific information that would endanger your safety or compromise your current assignment. Sandra expressed her preference for remaining in Millbrook, where she had established comfortable routines at Elegant Treasures and developed positive relationships with colleagues who knew her only as a reliable jewelry store employee. The possibility of starting over in a new location with another constructed identity felt overwhelming after the stress of federal court proceedings. Betty Rodriguez welcomed Sandra back to full-time work at Elegant Treasures with genuine appreciation for her courage in testifying against the criminals who had robbed their store. Betty's support represented exactly the kind of normal workplace relationship that Sandra valued in her protected life. "You did the right thing," Betty told Sandra. "Those people needed to face justice for what they did to our store and all the other businesses they robbed." Sandra resumed her duties at Elegant Treasures with renewed appreciation for the quiet routine that had been disrupted by months of federal proceedings. Her experience as a key prosecution witness had demonstrated that even carefully protected individuals sometimes faced circumstances that required courage and public service that extended beyond their personal security concerns. The jewelry store where her involvement with federal law enforcement had begun now represented a return to the anonymous life that witness protection was designed to provide, but Sandra understood that her experience had changed her in ways that would affect how she approached future challenges and opportunities for contributing to the safety and security of her adopted community in Millbrook. 2 years after the trial, Sandra was organizing inventory when she noticed a young woman outside Elegant Treasures, hesitating near the entrance with the unmistakable body language of someone carrying a heavy burden. The woman's nervous glances and careful positioning reminded Sandra of her own hypervigilant behaviors during the early months of witness protection. "Can I help you find something?" Sandra asked gently as the woman finally entered the store. "I'm looking for someone who works here," the woman replied quietly. "Someone named Sandra Chen. I was told she might understand my situation." Sandra's pulse quickened, recognizing the careful phrasing that suggested federal involvement. "I'm Sandra. What can I do for you?" "Deputy Marshal Klein sent me," the woman whispered. "She said you successfully navigated federal court proceedings while maintaining your protected status. I'm facing similar challenges, and she thought you might offer advice." Sandra looked at this nervous young woman and saw herself from 2 years ago. Someone whose careful anonymity had been shattered by circumstances beyond her control, someone who needed to learn that being visible didn't always mean being vulnerable. "Let's talk in the back office," Sandra said, understanding that her experience had prepared her for something she'd never expected, helping others navigate the complex intersection of witness protection and civic duty. As they walked toward the office, Sandra realized that the tattoo hidden beneath her collar had led to more than just her own transformation. It had created a ripple effect that would continue helping others find courage when their hidden strengths were needed most. Sometimes the most powerful impact comes not from staying invisible but from stepping into the light when others need guidance through the darkness. What did you think of Sandra's incredible journey from anonymity to courage? Have you ever had to find strength in unexpected circumstances? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, featuring real courage in everyday situations.